Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Campaign Trail, our other historical podcast dedicated to discussing some of the most fascinating results in presidential elections throughout our history. Tonight, we'll be covering one of the most consequential races, not just in political history, but also in the history of American warfare and general politicking. And that is the 1860 presidential election, definitely one of the most memorable among historians and onlookers alike. A four-way race held at the beginning of a new decade at the peak of half a century of tensions brewing over the slavery issue that was about to rend the country apart and tear it asunder. The four candidates in that race were Abraham Lincoln of the newly formed Republican Party, only its second nominee for president. The Democratic Party was completely fractured between its northern and southern factions, with John C. Breckinridge representing the Southern Democratic Party from his home state of Kentucky, and Stephen Douglas from his home state of Illinois, a former opponent of Lincoln in a Senate race, challenging or contesting the election from the mainstream Democratic Party. And finally, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party forming that up. Looking at the placement in the election, Lincoln finished first with 180 electoral votes, satisfying the 152 electoral vote majority. Breckinridge finished in second with 72 electoral votes, sweeping the South from Texas up to Arkansas, down through the Deep South to Florida, and then up to North Carolina, also carrying Maryland and Delaware. John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party carried Virginia, a big prize at the time still, and Kentucky and Tennessee. Lincoln, as expected, swept the North, pulled off the Rust Belt, and won the two Pacific states at the time, California and Oregon, despite there being only minor electoral prizes there. But Bell came in third and Douglas came in last, electorally. When it came to the popular vote count, Douglas actually finished in second place, taking about 29.5% of the vote, which was a little under 10 percentage points behind Lincoln's 39.8% margin. Remember, at this time, still only white men could vote, and we're looking at an election in which, if I believe correctly, a state, for example, like South Carolina still had its legislature choosing to whom to award the electoral vote. So not exactly full suffrage by any means. But before we get more into this election, let's look a little bit at the background, since you obviously, as an audience, know the implications of the race, and you completely understand that Lincoln's election essentially precipitated the final tensions that would lead to secession and the beginning of the Civil War, essentially the boiling over of the slave issue that had been kicked as a can, like kicking the can down the road by previous generations of politicians and statesmen, dating all the way back to the abolition of the slave trade in the Constitution in 1808. So there are quite a few lead-ups that we need to discuss here because, although the slave issue and the kind of predecessors of the Civil War had been brewing for over a century, there were a few specific things in the 1850s, specifically the final decade before the war, that really formed the definite issues of the election and the campaign, although it was still a 19th century campaign, which is very different from a modern campaign by all metrics, and for the election as a whole. So the first was in 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. So this was a very, very, very important court case. To this day, it remains pretty much the first landmark court case, for worse in this instance, that people in legal circles are taught about with regards to civil rights law, mainly because it was just such an absurd ruling in that it completely restricted Black Americans as a class, and their ability to sue and their ability to be citizens was denied. So essentially, Dred Scott, in this case, was formerly a slave in Missouri, a border state at the time where slavery was legal, as in much of the South. And his owners took him to Illinois, where they stayed for a substantial period of time in what was then considered a free state. So he sued in court, arguing that since he had been held in a free state as a slave and was no longer in his native Missouri, he could no longer be considered a slave, and that he would, by default, by the laws of the state therein, be free, be a free man. And this worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had a threefold ruling. First, they said that persons of African descent cannot be and never were intended to be citizens under the U.S. Constitution, effectively meaning that the plaintiff, in this case Dred Scott, did not even have a standing to file a lawsuit in the first place. And obviously, by modern standards, that's completely absurd. And luckily, all Black Americans that were freed would eventually receive their citizenship upon the ratification of the 14th Amendment during the Reconstruction period, which thankfully holds true to this day as a critical amendment, both with regards to its equal protection clause and with its due process clause, which is frequently used by the Supreme Court to incorporate other constitutional rights expressly enumerated in the document down to the state level to ensure that people are protected through incorporation. The second part of the ruling, the property clause, stated that the property clause is applicable only to lands possessed at the time of the Constitution's ratification, which effectively ruled that Congress was not allowed to ban slavery in the territories. That single clause basically reaffirmed the already ruined Missouri Compromise from the Kansas-Nebraska Act by stating that Congress had no grounds to ban slavery in territories, which completely, usurped the Missouri Compromise. And the final part of this was that the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, not the 14th Amendment, prohibits the federal government from freeing slaves brought into federal territories, which again is a completely absurd ruling. So the Missouri Compromise is next on our list of lead-ups. We talked about it in our 1824 race. Essentially, they agreed to let Maine in as a free state to keep that balance between free and slave state influence in Congress, while letting Missouri come in as a slave state. But they said in the agreement that all states below Missouri's southern border in the future would automatically be slave states and all states above would be free states. And while that would benefit the Union in the long term, it worked as a solution for a long time. But since the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in new territories under any circumstances, that threw it out the window. Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act also helped that. It supplanted their attempt to ruin the Missouri Compromise in 1852 by opening up Kansas and Nebraska to the Transcontinental Railroad. And it essentially would allow for popular sovereignty in Kansas, which would make Kansas a slave state. And that's why it theoretically broke the compromise anyway before Dred Scott, because the state of Kansas is above the border parallel that had been put in place as the limit for slavery. Third off, you had ineffective leadership under Democratic presidents Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, especially the latter in Buchanan's administration pretty much sat and watched the United States shrivel up into the peak of the pre-war period. And Northern enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act really drew the dismay of Northerners, most of whom disapproved of slavery, even if they weren't active abolitionists. And the legal rights of that law were questioned under the Pierce administration. That's also around the time that Uncle Tom's Cabin was published by Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of the preeminent female authors in America in the 19th century, whose one-hit wonder essentially showed Northerners the true horrors of slavery that they had never, ever realized leading up to that point. The third trend was essentially the final trend, and that was the rise of the Republicans after the Whigs began to collapse in 1854. Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, our longest serving general, was the last Whig presidential nominee, lost to Franklin Pierce in a blowout, and that effectively brought about the end of the Whig Party, and the different factions eventually, for the most part, although not entirely, unified under the Republicans, who nominated John Fremont, a popular American who both the Democrats and Republicans sought as an 1856 candidate, but he lost to James Buchanan. So Lincoln was our second nominee as a Republican nominee for president, and he was the first Republican president ever to win an election, the first of many, as the party would come to dominate the American landscape in the post-war period as well throughout the Gilded Age. So, Eric, with my little introduction, do you have any introductory thoughts to add at all?
Yeah, I have a couple. The first I'll mention is on the regard of these cases. It's hard to overstate how cataclysmic Dred Scott was seen at the time. Even you can't even justify it at the time as it being a decision people were okay with. There had been this kind of conspiracy theory, but not really, called slave power at the time, which is very popular in the North, which basically held that the South and slave owners were trying to take control of the government and impose slavery everywhere, impose it into the North as well. The North had been under the assumption since the Constitution was founded that eventually slavery would go away. The end of the African slave trade was seen as one part of that, and they assumed that eventually the South would drop off and join them. The more they started to realize that wouldn't happen, the more concerns you got from Northerners in particular, but from a lot of people, that this just wasn't the right decision. The only people who really loved this were slave owners and hardcore Southern, proto-secessionists, if you want to call them that. Another factor here is the decline of the Whig Party. The Whig faction was still pretty interesting at the time because if you look at the presidential election results, it wasn't so much one presidential election as it was two. It was the northern presidential election where you had the northern and western, where you had Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, who were getting the top two. Breckinridge was on the ballot. He did well in California, but it was mainly a 1-2 show between Lincoln and Douglas. And Lincoln resoundingly defeated Douglas if you look at the northern votes. The South, it was between Douglas, who did okay but didn't win any of those southern states, between Bell, and between the Southern Democratic Party nominee. Sorry, mine is blanket, but Breckinridge. Those three. North Carolina, my home state, for example, was 100% between Breckinridge and between Bell. The interesting thing is, of course,
it's important just to interrupt briefly to remember, guys, that Abraham Lincoln was basically not on the ballot anywhere in the South, even if Southern whites were going to vote for him, which they weren't.
Yeah, even the handful of Southern states he was in Kentucky, he was in Virginia, I think he was in Maryland, which at the time was considered somewhat Southern. He got less than 3% of the vote in all of these states. So he did very poorly in the ones he got in. But the real divide became between basically the war Democrats, the Democrats who really, or what we would call basically the proto-secessionists who wanted a pro-slavery candidate, and between the former Whigs, who generally coalesced around John Bell, or between Douglas. The last factor I'll mention, which is again a really interesting factor, is people point to the four-way race, that if the Democrats had coalesced behind a single nominee, Lincoln probably wouldn't have won the election. That's actually not necessarily the case. Lincoln did very well in the states he needed to do to win. Even if Democrats had clobbered in the South, it would be very likely that he would have still won a majority of the electoral votes, given the map. The country was very much moving away from slavery as an idea of what people wanted. And this kind of boiling point with the Buchanan administration in particular, which I personally consider to be the worst president in American history, James Buchanan, just how abysmal he was. But you had these terms of mediocre placeholder presidents who were serving one term and then leaving. And nothing was being accomplished. Nothing was being moved on slavery. It was bound to get to a point. And so, as we'll show with some of the maps and some of what we're going to get into, this was a very contentious election, a very important election, and an election that the South ultimately reacted to by their own action, by seceding and by starting the Civil War. It really did prove to be calamitous in that way. Although in the long run, obviously, the result was preferable: the end of slavery and the Civil War, and the moving beyond that, at least as an institution, after so many years.
Yeah, and you made some good points, Eric, especially taking a look at the environment of the quote-unquote do-nothing presidents. And there's not really much to say. I mean, certainly Pierce and Buchanan were do-nothing presidents, and Buchanan was personally pleased with the outcome of the Dred Scott decision. I mean, you have to remember at this time it was a 6-2 decision. 6 of those justices were Jacksonian Democrats that really made up the bulwark of that decision. So it doesn't surprise me that that's what happened, especially Chief Justice Roger Taney himself, who was the preeminent Jackson appointee, and for worse in this case, not even for better or for worse, an influential Chief Justice. But before we get into the dynamics of the race, there were 3 other factors I forgot to mention that I wanted to mention. The first was actually what I'd like to call the proto-Civil War, the conflict in Bleeding Kansas, otherwise known as the Border War. And this was largely set up by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So at this point, you had a debate following the death of the Missouri Compromise over the concept of popular sovereignty, which, just like it sounds, would allow state voters to decide for themselves whether or not in a popular election they wanted their state to have slavery as a legal entity or means by which to enslave individuals and sell them within the state. So you had that conflict in Kansas, and you had essentially carpetbaggers coming in from outside of the Kansas territory, known as anti-slavery free staters, and then border ruffians who were carpetbaggers from Missouri, all rushing in on this new territory. And even though in the end, only about 200 people were killed or so, it still showed a huge conflict between the two factions, both of which provided alternative constitutions. They had the anti-slavery document was known as the Topeka Constitution, and the Lecompton Constitution was the pro-slavery constitution. And they both set up their own legislatures in their own state capitals, in Lecompton and in Lawrence. And President Buchanan at the time was clearly not just in a clandestine way, but also openly advocating for the pro-slavery faction. and the popular sovereignty faction. And that secession crisis, essentially, you could say that this helped brew that up to the election. The other issue that's pretty important to talk about was the rise of abolitionism in the North, specifically with John Brown, who did, for many abolitionists, become a martyr following his execution by the federal government for attempting to lead an arms raid on a Charlestown, West Virginia. At that time, it would have still been in Virginia, but nowadays it would be in West Virginia, on an armory. And he was hanged after he was apprehended by Robert E. Lee, tried with treason, essentially, for leading a slave insurrection. And, he became a martyr for the Union, for their troops, for other abolitionists, for freed blacks, etc. But that really greatly rose the tensions at the time. I mean, it was clear at that point that troubles had arisen within the country, and somebody like John Brown, the South was fearful that Brown would, essentially, one of the reasons throughout the slave era why the South focused on making sure slaves did not receive education was because they feared that they would be overthrown. Because if you look at the population percentages, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, overwhelming majorities for black individuals, 60-40, 60, 70-30, sometimes way higher in ratio of the number of slaves to the number of white owners at the time. So they were very, very frightened by the prospect of a slave rebellion because they knew that they would simply be outnumbered if it did happen. And the last thing, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And it was really interesting because Lincoln had a short stint in the U.S. House of Representatives during the Mexican-American War. He was always an intelligent lawyer, thinker, someone who made his thoughts very clear, wrote in a very concise style for the time period. Actually was good friends in the House with Alexander Stephens, who would later go on to be vice president of the Confederacy. But one of the things people forget about Lincoln was that he ran for Senate against Stephen Douglas. And these were known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And they did quite a few of these going around the state, essentially allowing individuals to hear them debate issues of national importance, not just state importance. But it's important to remember at this time that unlike House races and gubernatorial elections, even though suffrage was still limited, at this point it was before the passage and ratification of the 17th Amendment, which affected the 1914 election cycle. So at this point, we were still deep in a time period where senators were elected by state legislatures, not chosen by the individuals themselves. And that's how it went. And ultimately, Lincoln did not make it to the Senate. He lost in the legislative vote, but it convinced him to run a presidential campaign, which we will get into. So, Eric, do you have any other thoughts about the lead up, or can we get into the candidates?
I think we can get into the candidates, and there's some really interesting ones here. In fact, two of the candidates would ultimately defect to the Confederacy after the war, including, ironically, the head of the presidential nominee of the Constitutional Union Party. So it's a very unusual election in that regard.
Yeah, and it's interesting because with the Democrats at the start of the war, you essentially had three different factions of Democrats. You had devoted Southern Democrats, supportive of the war, supportive of secession, who opted to leave the Union, forsake their positions, and either take up fighting roles in the Confederate military or new positions in the Confederate government. Then you had Copperheads. These were Democrats, Tammany Hall, and other areas throughout the North, people like Fernando Wood, George Pendleton, just riddled with Copperheads. These were members of the Union elected to serve in the Union, particularly from House districts. But these Copperheads were called such because they favored peace. They did not want a war. They wanted to appease the South, and they were okay with the Confederacy existing, which pretty much led to them tacitly, often openly supporting the Confederacy. And then finally, you had people like Andrew Johnson. These people were war Democrats, meaning they supported the war, they supported the Union, they opposed secession. Somebody like Andrew Johnson was still openly and vehemently racist and opposed all of the policies of the moderate and radical Republicans when it came to implementing racial reform for freed blacks. But Andrew Johnson was still not in favor of secession. So those were the three categories. So war Democrats, secession was no-go, off the table for them. But it did not mean they supported Republican policies toward blacks, and it did not mean they didn't like the South, because that was certainly not true. They just weren't like the Copperheads. So to get into the...
And I was going to mention one more thing, which is specific to North Carolina, but other states had this as well, is the former Whigs. The South did have Whigs when the Whig Party was a thing. Many of them became Democrats after the Whig Party ended. Not many became Republicans, obviously. Many of these Whigs would ultimately become supporters of the Union, even during the war, specifically in North Carolina. There was a base of about 35% of voters, it's estimated, throughout the war that supported the Union, wanted to end the war, return to the Union. Most of these were former Whigs, who were moderates, who were not attached to slavery. They were usually from the Piedmont region, from the non-slave areas. We're talking about places like Tennessee, West Virginia as well, that didn't have the grounds for slavery, didn't have the wealth needed to own and manage slaves, and they opposed the institution of slavery. So you did have in the Appalachian region, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, these really, really resoundingly would ultimately become strong Republicans. Many of them during the war were still Whigs, and they didn't join the Republicans openly. But after the war, those areas turned into what today are Republican strongholds to this day, especially Eastern Kentucky or Eastern Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky,
Even
Western North Carolina.
even in 1868 in the Seymour Grant election, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina. If you looked at Tennessee, obviously after Shiloh, that state was one of the first to be reoccupied by the Union and thus one of the first to be readmitted. Most of the Republican votes in the South at that point were coming from freed black men who had just been enfranchised by the 14th Amendment and given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. And there was still Union military occupation there under the Military Reconstruction Act to protect them from oppression by the KKK so they could express their votes. But those white Southerners, if you will, in Tennessee in that region were among the few white voters at all to vote Republican in that race. But getting into the candidates, just so we can keep going here, I'll run through each nomination and convention, and then I'll ask Eric what he thinks about the candidates. Mm-hmm. So the Republican Party, again, it was only their second presidential ticket, still a fairly new party made up mostly of Northern Whigs, essentially, and four members of unionist parties. And they nominated Abraham Lincoln, an articulate speaker, a former adept lawyer. He'd run a Senate campaign. He didn't have much in the way of traditional political experience. He had a bit of a raspy, raised voice, sounded a bit awkward, was tall, a bit awkward in look and design, but he'd go on to be one of the most beloved leaders of the Republican Party, though one might not have expected him to get there because he only served one term in the House. But at this point, he was nominated over, quite a few other candidates. And his vice presidential nominee, since the convention selected both candidates at this point, primaries were not a thing, was Hannibal Hamlin, who was a senator from Maine, and he was dumped from the ticket in 1864 because, God help us, it was the worst decision ever made. But they thought Andrew Johnson would be needed to win the election as a Union candidate between the Democrats and Republicans. In the end, he didn't need Johnson. He easily swept George McClellan. And Johnson just ended up being a liability, whom I personally consider to be the worst president ever. But yes, if you look at the convention for the Republicans, it's quite interesting if we look at the balloting votes. If I'm trying to find it here. Yeah, so you had on the presidential ballot, you essentially had 3 rounds. So it really was not a long convention in total because, you've had Democratic conventions in the past in the pre-primary era just going on for hundreds and hundreds of ballots, just ridiculously. But the first 2 ballots, in fact, William Henry Seward was actually the leading contender for the presidency. And he was a senator from New York at the time. And he would eventually go on to serve as Secretary of State under the Lincoln administration. And we all know Seward's Folly, Alaska, which was considered a joke until they found oil in Alaska. Now it remains one of the most abundant sources of natural beauty and natural resources in the country. So Lincoln essentially took on the votes of Simon Cameron and Salmon P. Chase after they fell out of the balloting and was able to overtake Seward as they consolidated the consolidated the votes behind him. And, Hannibal Hamlin, he pretty much was in the lead on his first round of the vice presidential balloting, still a bit contested, but eventually Cassius Clay fell out of the running and he won easily on that vice presidential tally. So pretty strong Republican ticket going into the election. The Democratic Party.
Oh, can I mention real quick about you said you would, let me explain my thoughts on on each of the candidates. Yeah. So the Republican ticket's worth noting. The Republicans were not abolitionists. That was the Free Soil Party, or the Free Soil Party was no more slave states. The Republicans were not abolitionists, and the Lincoln ticket was not an abolitionist ticket. What it was a end the expansion of slavery ticket. It wanted to end basically to no more expansion of slavery, no slavery in territories. It said they wouldn't interfere with slave states and their slaves, but it would prevent the expansion. It would ultimately choke out slavery by making everything else not slave territory. In terms of its national policy, very similar to the Whigs in a lot of ways and to the Federalist, or is more of a industrial policy, tariffs, that sort of thing. So very much a northern centric one. But it is worth noting that Lincoln was not running as an abolitionist. The South interpreted his actions as an abolitionist, so they were wrong to do so. But he ran on a very relatively moderate ticket, which is why I think he did very well in the North. He wasn't running on some extreme viewpoint. His viewpoint was very much common among people in the North, which was that they did not want slavery expanded. They didn't like the Fugitive Slave Act. They
Well,
wanted
I
it
should
out
say
of there.
common and moderate at the time, although it would be incredibly
Mhm.
conservative by our
Sure.
standards.
By today's standards. But it's worth noting at the time, this was considered to be the middle ground as opposed to, and Douglas was the other side of the middle ground, moderate on slavery, but in terms of letting pro slavery, but in favor of letting states decide. The Republicans were the flip side of that. And I think that's why they did so
Yeah.
well in this election as opposed to the previous nominee, who was known for some controversial comments, very, very radical in a lot of his viewpoints.
Yep. So the Democratic Party was frankly just a disaster in
Mm-hmm.
1860. So much brewing conflict in a party that dominated the South over the issue of slavery, because you also had to account for its northern wing. And that balancing act did not go very well in the 19th century. Definitely better if you look at the divide between the Southern and Northern Democratic members of the House caucus in
Mm-hmm.
the 20th century. But it split. So there was one convention originally. The whole Democratic convention was held in April of election year 1860 in Charleston. And they intended to nominate a unified ticket as they had in all the previous elections. But 50 Southern Democrats said, screw this, and walked out of the convention over a dispute over slavery, viewing the frontrunner, Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, as not conservative enough on the issue of slavery because he supported popular sovereignty, which would allow individual states to vote and determine whether or not they wanted slavery to be legal. And as I mentioned, that was moderate at the time. The rest of the Democrats wanted unhindered expansion of slavery, especially the Southern faction. Not even, obviously, no one was even talking about abolition yet, but they didn't want any form of restriction on slavery at all in any way. So
Mm-hmm.
they split off. The convention in Charleston nominated Stephen Douglas for president and Georgia Governor Herschel Johnson for vice president. And the remaining Democrats reconvened in Baltimore, where they ran as the Southern Democratic Party, splitting the party in half. And although Douglas drew more popular votes raw, Breckinridge was able to sweep the South electorally as expected, and that allowed him to finish in second electorally. But the 14th vice president, Breckinridge, had actually been Buchanan's vice president, ironically, and he was chosen as the leader of the Southern Democratic Party. And interestingly, Joseph Lane of Oregon, of all places, as a senator, was picked as his vice president. Not that that makes a lot of sense, but he declined to be nominated as a candidate anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And then the final party was the Constitutional Union Party, which nominated John Bell, a Tennessee senator, for president, and Edward Everett, who was a former U.S. senator from Massachusetts. And it was formed by, the remnants of the defunct Know Nothing and Whig parties. This was essentially the group of lost souls that did not feel like joining the rest of their Whig colleagues in the Republican Party, but also didn't want to join their Southern colleagues in the Democratic Party. This Union Party, if you will, a constitutional Union Party, really just had that appeal with the misfits who didn't want to go into either column.
Mm-hmm. It was, again, the former Whigs, mainly people who favored unionism. The party was not in favor or opposed to slavery. It didn't mention it. All it mentioned was that it supported the union. They basically had no platform besides opposing anything that would break up the union. It was a very, very simple platform, and ultimately its presidential candidate would betray that platform, but many of its voters and members would go on to become Republicans in the next election because of their value of unionism over the inherent political issues that were dealing with the country. It's in many ways it's similar to yeah, but that it's really an interesting party on
Yeah.
that side.
I mean, mostly the party just wanted to avoid slavery altogether because they felt that just not talking about slavery, essentially, they felt that keeping up the strategy of kicking the can down the road that had been kept up for the
Yeah,
last 50 years prior to this was the best way to stave off secession. But at this point, they would have been just delaying the inevitable, essentially.
yeah,
Slavery would have eventually boiled over, and probably very soon if it had not been immediately after Lincoln's election.
yeah.
And
But for those who are wanting like just a brief explainer, too long didn't listen to it. Abraham Lincoln, moderate Republican, anti-slavery, anti-expansion of slavery, not in favor of banning it, but in opposing it. Douglas was pro-slavery as long as territories wanted it to be slavery. He was also a unionist though. Breckinridge, radical Southerner, was favored the right of secession, wanted slavery expanded to all the territories, and then John Bell was just running on this constitutional union, not breaking up the union ticket. So you had basically three of the four candidates were running as somewhat of a moderate issue, trying to either stall slavery or just ignore it. You only had one candidate, Breckinridge, running aggressively in favor of the expansion of slavery
And
everywhere.
the secessionist faction, even though they hadn't seceded yet, effectively just all threw their support behind Breckinridge, and they were
Mm-hmm.
pretty much just trying to attempt to force all of the anti-Republican candidates to coordinate their votes behind Breckinridge, or they wanted to
Mm-hmm.
potentially put the election in the House as a contingent race, where they would be made, where the choice would be made by the House up to that point before there
Mm-hmm.
were Republican majorities.
And I believe, as Harrison will mention later, I assume they did succeed in two states in getting a fusion ticket on the ballot, New York and New Jersey, where all the Democrats ran against Abraham Lincoln on a combined joint ticket, which they succeeded in those two states. But other than that, the Breckinridge gambit kind of backfired spectacularly, I would say.
Yeah, I mean the Unity Democratic ticket, much to my internal anger, did win New Jersey, but they did not win New York. They only took about 46.2% of the vote in New York, running under under. It said Stephen Douglas on the banner, but it was a Unity ticket. Um, but in many respects, throughout these states, it's like Eric said, you had two different presidential elections. Like Douglas was on the ballot throughout the South, but apart from a state like Missouri, where he won with a plurality, he pretty much failed through most of the South. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Georgia, 10%, Alabama, 15%, Mississippi, 4%. I mean, just abysmal margins compared to Breckinridge. And essentially, it was the three factions running because Lincoln obviously not most of these states wasn't even on the ballot. And the states he was on the ballot, he still did awful in. Even in Maryland, a border state, Lincoln was on the ballot there. He only got about 2% of the vote. If that just shows you
Mm-hmm.
how stark the ideological divide was between, say, a state like Maryland and a state like Pennsylvania. But I do have to shame my home state, unfortunately, for being the only northern state to vote against Abraham Lincoln at this point.
Mm-hmm. Although Lincoln did still receive a majority of the electoral votes, but
Yeah,
sadly,
but he lost
yeah,
the popular vote.
yeah. But you can see the patterns here in particular. The green is Breckinridge. You can see his margins were very, very huge in a lot of these southern states, but the Bell margins really, you can see where these future unionist posts were. They were in places like Tennessee, they were in North Carolina. You can see kind of these outlines of it. Even places in Kentucky that would ultimately
And
become Democratic, like these areas
you
right here,
know,
would ultimately come along that lines.
and I mean, Bell's victories were not cakewalks by any means.
No.
Virginia, his most valuable prize, he only won Virginia over Breckinridge by 156 votes, which is essentially 0.09%. A
Yep.
very, very tight race. And I mean, even Kentucky and Tennessee especially, still very close. Bell had decent performances in Georgia. He was only 8 points behind. And in Louisiana, he was only 4 points behind in the popular count. But throughout the rest of the South, Bell pretty much got destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And what's one other thing that's fascinating is kind of where Breckinridge was the dominant Democratic nominee. So first, I'll show Breckinridge first. You can see basically this is where Breckinridge, all of where his supporters came from. See the South, you can see these areas. He did very poorly in a lot of areas where he got basically no votes. But the places he got votes, he did very, very well. The two exceptions are Oregon and California, where he came very close in California, and I believe in Oregon, to winning those races. Those
I
were
mean, interesting.
four-way contests.
His vice presidential pick was from Oregon,
Yeah,
ironically. Not that that
yeah,
makes
but they came in four-way races. Then you compare, for example, to the Unionist nominee, John Bell. All those areas where Breckinridge got 0% of the vote or close to it, you could see where John Bell did very well. Stephen Douglas, his support was he got the second most votes in the country, but his support was so distributed throughout the country that he didn't really coalesce it in any one region aside from his home state of Illinois and southern Illinois and in Missouri where he eked out a win.
I mean, Missouri was just fractured enough for him to win a plurality victory versus, say, Illinois, where, I mean, he didn't do horribly in his home state. Again, remember that when he won his last Senate reelection, the state legislature decided it because it was pre-17th Amendment. So he never actually was on a popular statewide ballot against Lincoln, although Lincoln only won by 4 points or so, which was less than in other states like Ohio and Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth.
And then finally, you can see where Abraham Lincoln did best. You'll notice, of course, that in almost all of the South, Abraham Lincoln not only received no votes, he was not even on the ballot in most of these states. He was on the ballot in Virginia. He did okay, I think, by Southern standards in some of these states, but he was really running primarily a Northern ticket, and you can see he did very, very well in the North. He did narrowly win New York. He lost in New Jersey, but ran pretty close. You kind of zoom in here, and just to note, these maps are not mine. These maps I gathered from Wikipedia. You can find them on the page there. He did pretty poorly in New York City, as you can tell, but upstate and through a lot of these, especially in New England and in some of these states like Minnesota, he did very, very well, and he was able to far and away have a lead in the electoral and popular vote.
You still kind of saw the regional divide in the South between the border states and the deep South. You know, in the border states, even with states where Lincoln was on the ballot, you know, you definitely saw Lincoln's support in Rust Belt states weaker in the southern halves of those states. The border states, you saw more support for the Unionists mixed between that and Breckinridge. And I mean, just in the general deep South, obviously Lincoln was not even there on the ballot. But even with the Unionists, the Constitutional Unionist Party, generally weaker in the deep South when compared with those middle line border states like Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee, for example.
And of course, South Carolina was still appointing its electors.
No popular vote in South Carolina, although we know how they would have voted popularly almost.
Yeah, they only went to the popular vote after the Civil War. They finally realized, hey, we should probably let people vote for president. But again, this is the whole map again. You can kind of see where these battle lines are drawn in. There's a couple states where every candidate won a county, particularly California. I believe that's Nevada County or Nevada County, but what would now be Nevada County. But all four candidates did win counties in California, and I believe they maybe did so in some of these northern states as well, particularly Missouri. But really fractured.
States, yes, for sure.
Yeah, very, very fractured. It is also worth noting, support for Breckinridge was not necessarily at the time support for secession. I do have a map to kind of show that, which is Breckinridge did win North Carolina, for example. North Carolina was the last state, or one of the last states to secede. They did so after Tennessee, after the rest of the, in particular, I mentioned North Carolina because I'm from North Carolina, but they had a very, very strong Unionist sentiment. It's worth noting, even though it went to Breckinridge by about 4%, it was still not a pro-secession state until after Fort Sumter. In fact, there was a referendum after the presidential election on whether or not to have a convention on secession, whether to just have a meetup about it. And you'll notice that the no votes won by about 1%. So not even wanting to consider a convention on secession. Won by about 1%. Now, if you might say, oh, that's still pretty close. The other thing worth noting to note here is that among those voters for the votes basically in favor of a convention, the vast majority of them opposed breaking up the Union. So it's, again, worth noting, there was a Unionist sentiment in the South in a lot of areas, particularly in North Carolina.
It's not in the deep South. In the deep South, the vote for Breckinridge meant 100% secession, goodbye, United States.
Yes. In places like North Carolina, it meant more voting for the dominant Democratic ticket rather than a bunch of former Whigs or voting for the Constitutional Union Party, which, again, was new and had no platform. It is worth noting, of course, North Carolina did ultimately secede, and many of those people who opposed secession did ultimately support it, and although some of them ultimately came back. It was a very weird situation, but it is, again, worth noting, vote for Breckinridge was not necessarily a vote to secede. It was just a vote for the most radical pro-Southern platform or pro-slavery platform, if you, for a better term, because the Civil War was ultimately about slavery. It was not about any sort of Southern rights.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, it was interesting when you look at this race. I mean, just to cap it off, as a conclusion, up to this point, even though it was still only white men who could vote, it was the highest turnout in history up to that point. I mean, it was 81.2% turnout, which was record breaking.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's the second highest from the time period when you compare it against 1876. And if you look at it, one of the big stats that's mentioned on Wikipedia even is since Andrew Jackson had won re-election in 1832, all six of the presidents that followed him won only one term. And the last four of those had won the popular vote by under 51% each time.
Mm-hmm. And out of those six, I'm pretty sure the only one of any note historically, the only one historians look back with any sort of fondness on was James Polk. And he ran for one term mainly because he
Well,
accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish. The rest of these guys, Franklin Pierce, Zachary Taylor,
Well,
Millard
to be
Fillmore.
fair, people like Fillmore and Tyler assumed the presidency after deaths, and Polk ran for his first term as a dark horse on the promise he'd only serve one term anyway, regardless of what he accomplished. And he did
Mm-hmm.
accomplish everything that he sought to accomplish, which proved to be good for him. And just as a trivia thing to show that some things never change, Somerset County, where I live in New Jersey, was a solid Democratic county voting for Stephen Douglas, and it is still a Democratic county today. So it has come full circle. In fact, even in 1864, against literally an awful candidate in James McClellan, pretty much all of North Jersey backed McClellan.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I
And it's
created
worth noting, yeah, and
McClellan.
yeah, worth noting the county I came from, or the county I was born in, Catawba County, did vote for Breckinridge and did vote to secede, but ultimately turned out to be a strongly Republican county after the Civil War. There was truly a realignment election in this case, where you saw a lot of people's party loyalties to the old Democratic Party, this Jacksonian model, truly just dissolve in a fantastic fashion, and ultimately go forward into what will become the ultimate, the following election of 1864, and then beyond with the Peace Democrats, the National Union ticket in '64, the Copperheads, and then ultimately the return of segregationist Democrats following the war.
Yep, and this election effectively is the final nail in the coffin among the countless lead up causes to the Civil War. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's always listed on there, and there were many things leading up to the Civil War, but this election was essentially the penultimate thing on that list in terms of events. And there were a few more things that started. I mean, you had the Crittenden Compromise. That was pretty much it. After that point, Southern states began to succeed. The Corwin Amendment went through. The attack on Fort Sumter began the following year, and before the country knew it, we were embroiled finally in that grand conflict over the slavery issue that had dominated the whole nation for the last half century.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I do
Eric,
think it would be kind of interesting to like go into a where did they go from here of these candidates. So we know where Lincoln went. We know where this all ultimately ended up, right? But people don't know where Stephen Douglas ended up or John Bell. So I can explain very quickly what kind of happened to these guys at a point. But it's very interesting where the career trajectories of these people ultimately went, because it was a large contest with four different candidates. Any one of them could have been president, given the right circumstances, aside from probably John Bell. But it is really interesting to see where these guys, where these statesmen ultimately turned up. Many of them, the Civil War fractured a lot of people's political views. It really did reshape the way people were considering politics.
well, you can discuss that. I mean, we're pretty much done with the election coverage.
Yeah. So I'll start with Breckinridge. Breckinridge obviously he was known as having secessionist sympathies before the election even, and was in favor of secession. It's no surprise that after the war, or after the election, he eventually at first tried to present himself as a moderate, and then ultimately left and abandoned the Union and joined the Confederacy uh, after the Republican administration was able to garner troops to, I would say, defend itself against Southern aggression. At Fort Sumter, they ultimately were able to do that, and he ultimately turned out to support the Confederacy. After he served in the war, he was Secretary of War under Jefferson Davis, and then immediately, basically after that happened, told him to surrender. It was a pretty weird situation. Breckinridge, after the war, he kept the Confederate records intact and was ultimately extended amnesty along with all the other Confederates in 1868, and then died afterwards. To this day, Kentucky, he has a weird reputation among Confederate supporters. He seemed pretty well. Everyone else kind of sees him as a traitor, and rightfully so. John Bell, like like Breckinridge, did go ahead and support the Confederacy. In fact, he lobbied for support of the Confederacy. He lobbied for people to support the Confederacy and to not support the Union. He basically, and that was where he ended up. He got involved in that. He died in 1969. His home state of Tennessee. Obviously, he ultimately joined the Confederacy, although it was one of the later ones. And as a result of him being in it, he was barred from the sort of typical service you would expect from that. Douglas is the really interesting one, though. Douglas and Lincoln were political rivals for quite a while, but I think they respected each other's intellect quite a bit. He after the war, he actually died very shortly after the war was declared. He died in June of 1861, so very briefly into the war. But after it was declared, he met with Abraham Lincoln, basically over. And Lincoln had presented him with the plan, the 75,000 troops into the South. Douglas actually said he needed 200,000 troops. So not only was he pro-Union, he was aggressively pro-Union. He tried to lobby support for the Union, but his untimely death in 1861 really did hamper that. And he's, to this day, again, seen as a mixed record, especially given his support for slavery. But it is worth noting that he did support the Union, unlike the other two Democratic or quasi-Democratic candidates, as you would call it. He was the one who did not fall away and support the Confederacy and have all the consequences that came with that. Obviously, we know where Abraham Lincoln went. He became the president, led through a long war that he didn't ask for, that was kind of thrown at him. Did it very well, and is today seen as one of the greatest presidents of all time, as we'll mention in our episode of that on Ranked the Presidents. But these guys all really had unique positions and ended up. I mean, if you had told me beforehand, before I did the research for this, that the Constitutional Union Party, that their founder would have or the presidential candidate would have immediately supported the Confederacy, I would have thought you were joking, but that turned out to be the case. Just an interesting little historical tidbits there.
Mm-hmm. So with that, we pretty much covered the whole course of the election. This was a nice, quick, really succinct and detailed episode. So if you don't have anything else you'd like to add, Eric, I think we'll wrap up this one and wait until next Friday for our next episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we mentioned, I think this is a really, really good overview of this election. Obviously, you're free to look up other stuff, and I would look up those Wikipedia maps again. Those are a really good resource. All of the counties are there, and you can kind of see the county lines if you're familiar with them. It's a very interesting look back. But yeah, I think we've pretty much covered most of what we can with this election. It happened, and then the rest is history. One of the few elections where you can look at and say, immediately after, everything just hit the fan. Immediately.
Yeah. So thanks again for watching, everyone. We'll see you next week.